Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are strapping in for what is maybe the most structurally complex mission we've tackled yet.
Yeah, this is dense stuff.
We're synthesizing a huge stack of source materials that offer a highly detailed, some might say astonishingly specific map of the final period of tribulation, often called the last week in prophecy.
That's right. When people look at eschatology, they often expect, broad strokes, maybe symbols. But the sources we have today, they just defy that expectation.
Completely.
They present this meticulous timeline, a really specific cast of characters, and a detailed chronology. It's all derived from linking Daniel and Revelation together. So our goal today has to be absolute clarity.
Yeah.
We need to establish this precise framework, this prophetic clock, if you will, for you, the listener.
Okay, so our mission then is to unpack the series of linked ideas about this final 1 week, and we're focusing really intensely on the initial period, the first half of that week. It seems to be centered entirely around the actions, the identity, and crucially, the protection provided by two key groups, the two witnesses and the 144,000.
It's the core of it. This first half is defined, according to these sources, by the deepest suffering for the saints, yes, but also by the most, extraordinary supernatural protection.
A real paradox. Okay, let's get started. Okay, let's unpack this then, starting with the core definitions from the sources. It's kind of like we're building a specialized glossary just to understand this final time frame.
Good way to put it.
Let's start with the fundamental timeline premise. This idea of the 1 week. It comes straight out of Daniel 9.27, right? Where it references a covenant confirmed for 1 week.
Correct. And the context there is that the antagonist figure will cause sacrifice and offering to cease. The key phrase is, in the midst of the week.
In the midst. That phrase seems pivotal.
It absolutely is. The interpretation of Daniel 9.27 is really the bedrock of this entire system we're looking at. And that critical point, the concept of the midst or halfway point, our sources spend quite a bit of time noting that the exact translation has been debated.
How so?
Well, does it mean during the half or at the exact halfway point or just generally in the middle? These subtle differences, they can profoundly impact when you place the Great Tribulation within the 7 years.
Right, because if he stops the sacrifices at the middle, does the worst part happen before or after?
Exactly. And the sources we're examining today, they adopt a very specific view on this. They argue strongly against the idea that the suffering spans the entire 7 years.
Okay, so what's their take?
They assert that the Great Tribulation for the saints, and that distinction is crucial, is confined precisely to the first half of the 1 week.
The first 3.5 years.
Yes. The reasoning they provide is, pretty direct. The antagonist breaks the covenant, stops the temper sacrifice, and initiates this major persecution at the halfway point. Therefore, the most severe suffering for believers must occur during the 3.5 years leading up to that covenant break.
Why must it?
Because, they argue, if the tribulation for the saints happened after the midpoint or stretched over the whole 7 years, it would contradict other scriptures, especially Jesus' words about the days needing to be shortened for the elect's sake. The sources feel this interpretation dictates the duration experienced by believers.
Okay, so the saints' tribulation is locked into that first half. What does that mean in concrete terms, like duration-wise? Because the sources seem remarkably consistent, linking Daniel and Revelation here.
They are. It's mathematically locked into a 3.5-year span. This first half is consistently defined in 3 equivalent ways across the text.
Which are?
42 months, then 1,260 days, and finally the phrase a time, times, and half a time.
Which all equate to 3.5 years.
Precisely. This equivalence is critical because it provides a fixed temporal limit for the saints' most extreme suffering. The sources really emphasize this consistency across Daniel and Revelation as sort of divine confirmation that this period is deliberately marked out.
So that fixed duration, 1,260 days, sets the clock. Now, we have to define the opponent, the one who really sets this clock in motion. The sources spend a lot of time on the antagonist figure, the beast, the son of perdition. It's not a simple definition, is it?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
It's presented as a layered entity, combining both political and religious power. It's almost like an evolution of power, drawing from several prophetic titles.
Right.
Well, the sources equate the man of lawlessness, the son of perdition, and the abomination of desolation all to this same figure or system. But to really understand this first half period, we have to grasp the specific identity the sources assigned to this entity during that time.
Which they define as a kind of hybrid power.
Correct. Specifically as the Babylon harlot riding the red beast.
Okay, unpack that. The harlot and the beast.
The harlot is further identified very pointedly, as the Babylon papacy. And this papacy is seen as controlling the world beast government. So the sources present this as a combined structure.
So a religious power controlling a global political system.
Yes, they actually use terms like a super Babylon Roman papacy. They argue that this entity has miraculously recovered from the deadly wound prophesied in Revelation.
The wound to the beast.
Yes. And that it now holds sway over the global political structure, which is the beast government.
Okay, let's just pause on that for a second. We need to be clear we're reporting directly on the source material here, because that's a very controversial and highly specific geopolitical and religious claim. What's the link the sources use to so confidently identify the Babylon papacy with the harlot figure in Revelation?
It's a connection they build primarily on identifying the harlot with a reference to 7 hills in Revelation 17.
Which is traditionally associated with Rome.
Exactly. They tie that geography directly to Rome, and then they interpret the historical recovery of the papacy's influence after periods of decline as the literal healing of the deadly wound.
Okay.
So for the purpose of understanding this timeline, this identification is absolutely essential because it defines the nature of the persecution during the first half. It's presented as enforced global worship, driven by this powerful, unified religious and political system.
That level of specificity is, well, it's striking,
Right.
but the sources don't actually stop there, do they? They even distinguish between two phases of this beast power over the total 7-year period. It seems to evolve.
It does evolve.
Yeah.
And this is a subtle but really crucial insight in these materials. They clearly delineate between the beast of the first half, which they often call the Babylon harlot riding Red Beast 1, and the beast of the second half, which they term Red Beast 2.
What's the difference?
The crucial difference lies in who's in control. Beast 1, during the first 1,260 days, is dominated by the harlot's religious authority. That's what's pushing the worship agenda, the persecution of saints.
Okay.
Beast 2, however, emerges after the saints are rescued, after the first resurrection. This is the red beast after it has shaken off the harlot. It becomes purely political power.
So the political beast turns on the religious power.
Yes, the sources interpret Revelation 17 that way, the beast and its horns turning on and destroying the harlot. But that happens in the second half. The focus of the first half, the tribulation periods for saints, is entirely on that unified harlot-controlled system.
Got it. So we have the players define the harlot beast system, the saints, the witnesses 144K. And we have the fixed 1,260-day timeline for the saints' tribulation. But what actually kicks off this whole final last week? What's the trigger event? The moment that starts the 12,260-day clock ticking.
There's a very precise physical trigger event described. The last week begins, according to these sources, when the son of perdition sits in the physical temple.
The temple in Jerusalem.
Yes, a rebuilt physical temple. They cite Mark 13.14 and Matthew 24.15, identifying this act, the abomination of desolation, standing where it ought not, or standing in the holy place, as the precise starting gun for the final 7-year countdown.
And that action, the seating of the son of perdition in the temple, it must immediately transition the world into that great tribulation phase we discussed. What's the mechanism for that sudden shift?
Well, the sources argue that once this figure sits in the temple, claiming divinity essentially, it immediately triggers the enforcement of beast worship and the mark of the beast system onto the entire world.
Wow, no gradual rollout then.
No, not according to this view. It's depicted as the immediate, non-negotiable imposition of the antagonist system. And that is what initiates the period of intense tribulation for the saints, because they're instantly forced to choose martyrdom or compromise. The sources define this first half, those 12,260 days, entirely as the period of the beast's reign.
Yeah, and what's really essential to grasp here is that the 12,260 days represent a period of highly specific suffering for believers. The core argument, really the linchpin of the source material we're looking at, is this precise delineation of when that suffering happens, and maybe even more importantly, when that suffering absolutely stops. It creates this very clear division between the first half and the second half of the week.
Right, so let's focus on the nature of this first half. If it's defined as the 12,260 days of the beast's reign, what does that period actually look like for believers on the ground? How intense is it meant to be? It is entirely defined by the forced imposition of beast worship and the resulting great tribulation for the saints. The sources, they really pull no punches here. They assert that this tribulation is so uniquely severe that it necessitates a massive wave of martyrdom.
Where do they get that idea of unique severity?
They rely heavily on passages like Daniel 12.1 and Matthew 24.21, which explicitly promise that this specific tribulation will be unlike anything else in history. You know the verse. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be.
That paints a pretty dire global picture of extreme duress, total pressure.
It does. However, the sources also identify a really essential element of divine provision during this same 1260-day period. It's not presented as all saints being immediately martyred or left completely defenseless.
Ah, okay. So there's a counter-narrative running alongside the persecution.
Exactly. This is the kind of balancing act described for the first half. While many are martyred, the sources identify a specific place of refuge for a group of protected believers. This group is symbolized by the woman in Revelation chapter 12.
The woman clothed with the sun.
That's the one. She represents, in this interpretation, the protected portion of the church, and she flees to the wilderness place of preparation.
And the duration of her protection there, that's key to the whole timeline, isn't it?
Absolutely critical. She is protected and supernaturally nourished there for the exact duration of the first half, 12,260 days. The sources emphasize this isn't just about physical provision like food and water, but also a kind of spiritual shielding designed to protect these believers from the direct face-to-face onslaught of the serpent, Satan, who's empowering the beast.
So divine provision amidst absolute chaos.
That's a central feature of how the first half is depicted. It demonstrates that even while the beast system is apparently reigning supreme, God's protective hand is still actively shielding a remnant.
But wait a minute. If the beast, this Babylon papacy, controlling the world government, as the sources define it, is forcing global worship, demanding the mark, how can a group of saints just remain safely tucked away somewhere for 12,260 days? I mean, that suggests that they need more than just food. They need a powerful shield, maybe military or spiritual.
And that is precisely the indispensable role assigned to the two witnesses.
Ah, okay. They're the protectors.
Yes. The sources are explicit that the two witnesses do far more than just preach the eternal gospel during this time. They actively serve as the functional shield for those in the place of preparation.
Pow!
They are tasked, divinely empowered, with keeping the saints safe and actively crushing the beast's power throughout those 1260 days.
Crushing the beast's power, that sounds significant.
It is. Some interpretations within the source material even suggest that the mountain, or the place of refuge that the saints flee to, isn't necessarily just a location, but it is the spiritual and perhaps even physical protection afforded by the very presence and the powerful actions of the two witnesses. They create the safe zone.
Okay, so their ministry is twofold. It's a spiritual warning, don't take the mark. And it's also a form of physical defense. They're basically running cover for the protected saints for 3.5 years.
That's the picture painted. Which brings us neatly to the finish line of the saints' tribulation period. What is the critical takeaway, the absolute endpoint of suffering for believers, which must happen by the end of the 12,260 days?
There's a hard stop.
There's a hard stop for the saints' experience of tribulation. The critical theological point made repeatedly in these sources is that their great tribulation must end with the first resurrection.
It has to conclude then.
Yes, they treat this as a non-negotiable element of the entire prophetic timeline.
But why? Why is the first resurrection the hard stop? Why couldn't the saints, maybe the protected ones, just endure into the second half of the week?
Because the first resurrection is presented as the mechanism for ultimate transformation and safety. It's the divine action by which the saints, both the martyred ones who are resurrected and the remaining living believers who are transformed in the twinkling of an eye, are physically caught up into the air to meet the Lord.
The rapture, essentially.
Yes, tied explicitly to the first resurrection event. So if they are physically removed from the earth at that 1260-day mark, they are, by definition, removed from the jurisdiction of the next phase of divine activity, which is judgment, not persecution.
Okay, that sequence then defines the ultimate transition point. The first half of the week ends, the two witnesses are overcome, the first resurrection occurs, and then what follows immediately on earth.
Then the focus shifts entirely. It moves from the beast persecuting the saints to God pouring out judgment upon the world system that embraced the beast. The 7 plagues, or the 7 bowls of God's wrath, are poured out on the earth.
And the saints experience none of that.
None of it. The sources consider the 7 plagues to be God's direct wrath, described as an even more severe form of tribulation than the 12,260 days of persecution by the beast. And crucially, because the saints are resurrected and raptured precisely at the 12,260-day mark, right before the plagues begin, they do not experience them.
So it's a very clean break.
A very clean break. The first half is the tribulation endured by believers. The second half involves the wrath poured out on the unbelieving world and the beast system itself.
Okay, this is where the source material really starts connecting deep spiritual preparation with almost unbelievable supernatural action. We've established the two witnesses as the protectors during that 12,260-day period. But the sources give them this fascinating dual identity, linking them directly to the final wave of prepared believers.
Yes, absolutely. This is a cornerstone of the framework presented in these sources. They establish a clear, functional equivalence. The two witnesses are the 144,000 sealed ones.
So not necessarily just two literal individuals named Enoch and Elijah, as some traditions hold.
While respecting those views, the sources we're focusing on tend to see it differently. They view the two witnesses more as representing the final, manifest prophetic ministry on earth, a ministry led or embodied by this specific group, defined by their divine sealing and unique preparation, the 144,000.
Okay.
They're seen as the culmination of prophetic ministry for that age, carrying the spiritual authority needed for this unprecedented time of confrontation.
And the 144,000 themselves, they're highly defined by their spiritual state, aren't they? It's not just presented as a headcount of saved people.
No, far from it. They're specifically defined as the first fruits redeemed from among men. This term, first fruits, implies a very specific spiritual quality.
Such as?
Well, they're characterized in Revelation 14 by purity, symbolized by being undefiled with women, often interpreted as spiritual fidelity to Christ, not necessarily literal celibacy. They have no deceit in their mouths. They are faultless before God's throne.
So they represent the final, perfected harvest.
In a sense, yes. A special group belonging directly to God and the Lamb, uniquely prepared and set apart for this intense 12,260-day confrontation with the beast.
That preparation then becomes absolutely critical. How do they reach this state of readiness, and how do they receive the kind of power needed to, frankly, take on a global government controlled by the papacy, according to these sources? What is this sealing process that transforms the 144,000 into the powerhouse? Two witnesses.
Okay, the preparation centers on receiving the seal described as the seal of the living God, marked on their foreheads.
Protection and ownership.
Yes, and the sources tie this sealing process directly back to the symbolic mandate given in Revelation chapter 10. Remember the angel with the little book?
Yes, John is told to take it and eat it.
Exactly, and John, in that instance, is seen as symbolically representing this final group, the 144,000. The act of eating the little book is equated by these sources to receiving and fully assimilating the eternal gospel.
Okay, hold on. What exactly do the sources define this eternal gospel to be? Is it different from the basic gospel message of salvation through Christ? How does it empower them specifically for this time?
That's a great question. The sources interpret the eternal gospel, which is mentioned specifically in Revelation 14, right alongside the 144,000, not merely as the foundational salvation message, but as the final comprehensive prophetic warning that is specific to the beast's end-time system.
So it's more detailed.
Much more detailed. It's presented as a message that reviews the full extent of the antagonist scheme, identifying the specific nature of the Babylon papacy system, warning about the beast's mark, explaining the consequences of worshiping the beast, and announcing the immediate proximity of God's judgment. Eating the little book, therefore, means fully internalizing this final unveiled prophetic truth.
Knowledge is power in this case.
But it's more than just knowledge. The sources emphasize it's about spiritual empowerment. Receiving the seal through this process is explicitly equated to receiving the Holy Spirit like the latter rain.
The latter rain, like the final outpouring of the Spirit.
Exactly. This latter rain is interpreted as the final full outpouring of the Holy Spirit's power, specifically the power necessary to operate prophetically and supernaturally against the beast's overwhelming global influence. This spiritual empowerment is what guarantees their endurance and enables their incredibly mighty ministry for the full 12,060 days.
Okay. So once they are sealed, prepared, and empowered with this latter rain Holy Spirit, their mandate is clear. The 12,260-day prophecy, performed in sackcloth. What's the dual focus of that ministry then?
They prophesy, and the sackcloth is significant. It symbolizes deep humility, mourning, and earnest repentance, even as they wield immense power. It shows they're acting on God's behalf, not their own. Their mission is absolute and twofold.
First,
to warn vehemently against beast worship and taking the mark, a message of resist, do not comply.
And second,
Concurrently, to preach the eternal gospel, that specific final truth that exposes the whole system and offers salvation to the remnant who will heed the warning.
but as you said, they're not just evangelists standing on soapboxes getting arrested. They are described as the 2 olive trees and 2 lampstands standing before the God of the earth, and they possess genuinely destructive power. They are the ones actively crushing the beast's forces, as you mentioned earlier. How do the sources detail the scope of this supernatural authority? It sounds immense.
The symbolism of olive trees and lampstands is huge. It suggests a direct, uninterrupted connection to God's presence and power, like Zechariah's vision. And yes, this connection grants them literal authority over nature and over their enemies. They are endowed with, frankly, terrifying supernatural power,
Such as?
such as the authority to command fire to come down from heaven, or metaphorically, from their mouths to consume their enemies and try to harm them. The source material points directly to the account in 2 Kings 1, where fire consumes the soldiers sent to capture Elijah, as evidence that this power is not merely symbolic but literal defense.
Wow. Okay, can we break down the specific plagues and powers they wield? Because this is crucial to understanding how they could possibly hold the line against a unified world government for 3.5 years.
Yes, their powers read like a greatest hits compilation from Moses and Elijah. Firstly, they hold the authority to shut the sky so it does not rain for the entire duration of their prophecy, 12,260 days.
A global drought.
Or at least a drought impacting the beast's power base significantly.
Yeah.
Secondly, they can turn water sources into blood, directly echoing Moses' authority during the plagues of Egypt before the Exodus.
Okay. Rain and water controlled.
And thirdly, they apparently have the authority to strike the earth with any plague as often as they desire. It's depicted as an open-ended arsenal of divine judgment they can deploy defensively.
So this means they are actively interfering with the beast's political control, its logistics, maybe even its economy?
Precisely. This is the mechanism behind the claim that they crush the beast's forces. They are, according to this view, literally neutralizing the antagonist's military, political, and economic capabilities through targeted, supernatural, divine intervention.
How so?
Well, think about it. If the global system under the beast is dependent on resources, agriculture, stability, the 2 witnesses, by controlling rain, water quality, and striking with plagues at will, can fundamentally destabilize the beast's ability to enforce its rule globally. This disruption is what creates the necessary space, the breathing room, for the protected saints to remain safe in the wilderness place for those 1,260 days. They're running interference on a massive scale.
That makes sense. Now, the sources repeatedly use the prophet Elijah as the key, almost the interpretive lens for understanding this whole period. Let's really dive deep into that typology. His life is presented as this perfect structural blueprint for both the 2 witnesses and the protected saints during this first half.
Yes. The parallels drawn are not seen as merely incidental. They're presented as divinely engineered types or patterns that map out the timeline and the dynamics almost perfectly. Let's look at the timing and the environmental conditions first. The drought.
Right. Elijah famously closed the sky so it did not rain for how long exactly?
For 3 years and 6 months. And the sources highlight that Luke chapter 4, verse 25 confirms this specific duration. 3.5 years.
12,060 days.
Exactly the same period.
Yeah.
This period of 3.5 years of drought in Elijah's time is seen as directly symbolizing the 12,260-day first half of the final week, during which the 2 witnesses will likewise have power to close the heavens. This direct temporal match gives the sources enormous confidence in their 12,260-day definition for the saints' tribulation.
Okay, that's the duration parallel. Then there's the theme of protection during the famine that resulted from Elijah's drought.
Correct. Elijah himself was supernaturally protected and nourished. First by ravens at the brook Cherith, then later in Zarephath by the widow, where her jar of flour and jug of oil miraculously never ran out for the duration.
And the sources see this as
the precise spiritual parallel for the protected saints during the tribulation. Just as Elijah was kept safe and fed, the saints, symbolized by the woman, are protected and nourished in the wilderness place of preparation for the exact same duration, 1260 days. The provision is supernatural, it's guaranteed, and it lasts for the full 3.5 years.
Got it. Next up in the Elijah story is the conflict, the big confrontation. Elijah versus the 850 false prophets of Baal and Asherah on Mount Carmel.
Yes, and this is used as the analogy for the confrontation aspect of the 2 witnesses' ministry. Elijah didn't just debate. He called down fire, defeated, and then executed the 850 false prophets.
A decisive victory.
Utterly decisive. And this sets the exact blueprint, according to the sources, for the two witnesses. They too will crush the religious and military forces aligned with the beast, using fire from their mouths and plagues to actively dismantle the antagonist's influence and personnel during their 12,260 days. They are seen as the final prophetic agents purging the earth of false religion just before the end.
Okay, drought, protection, confrontation. What's the final parallel from Elijah's ministry that seals the typology for the first half?
It's the climax involving resurrection and transformation. Just before Elijah's own ascension into heaven, remember he resurrected the dead son of the widow of Zarephath.
Right, a powerful miracle.
The sources interpret this specific act of resurrection by Elijah, occurring within his ministry time frame, as a direct foreshadowing. It points unmistakably, they argue, to the fact that at the very end of the two witnesses' 3.5-year ministry, the first resurrection must occur.
Connecting Elijah bringing life back then to the resurrection of the saints at the end of the 1260 days.
Exactly. It links Elijah's entire 3.5-year ministry cycle, marked by drought, power, protection, confrontation with false religion, and culminating in resurrection life directly to the 1260 days of the two witnesses. Their ministry also culminates in the resurrection of the martyrs and the simultaneous catching up or transformation of the living protected saints.
So the Elijah narrative isn't just a loose comparison, it's used as the literal structural key. A 3.5-year period of intense conflict, marked by supernatural protection, the destruction of false religion's power, and climaxing in the definitive salvation and removal of the saints via resurrection. That is an incredibly tight, interwoven framework.
It is, and it leads directly to the dramatic conclusion of that first half.
Right.
So this exhaustive analysis of the 1260 days, this period of the witness's power and the saints' protection, it brings us to the inevitable climax, which paradoxically involves the defeat of the two witnesses.
Defeat, after all that power.
Temporary defeat. And it's crucial to understand within this framework, their defeat isn't seen as a failure. It's actually presented as the necessary trigger, the event that forces God's final, swift act of redemption for the saints.
Okay, so the timing of their defeat is the critical turning point in the entire 7-year timeline. It marks the exact moment the first half ends.
Precisely. The sources pinpoint the defeat of the witnesses happening at the exact conclusion of their ministry mandate. It says, when they have finished their testimony, meaning their 12,060 days are completed, then the beast from the abyss makes war against them.
The beast from the abyss, is this different from the harlot-controlled beast?
Potentially. Or perhaps it signifies the beast drawing on a deeper, more demonic power source for this final act.
Right.
Regardless, this specific feast is the one given power, for a very brief moment, to overcome God's two prophets, defeat them, and kill them. This happens right at the 12,260-day mark.
And if the witnesses were the shield for the protected saints, their death means that shield is suddenly removed, right? What's the historical parallel the sources use for this sudden defeat after such a powerful ministry?
They go back to Elijah again. They reference Elijah's sudden flight into the wilderness after his 3.5 years of powerful ministry, specifically when he was threatened by Queen Jezebel,
Jesus.
whom the sources strongly equate with the Babylon harlot figure. So, just as the harlot beast entity was being crushed by the witness's power throughout the 12,260 days, the harlot, perhaps channeling the power of the beast from the abyss, secures this temporary, vengeful victory right at the very end of that period.
The implication of this defeat, then, is immediate and existential for any saints still on earth, especially those who are being protected.
Absolutely catastrophic. The sources explicitly note that this final defeat means the two witnesses can no longer protect the saints. The physical and spiritual refuge they somehow provided is instantly gone, if God didn't intervene immediately at that point.
The tribulation would become unsurvivable.
Exactly. The persecution would escalate uncontrollably, becoming utterly unsurvivable for anyone identified as a believer left on earth. This is the precise moment, the sources argue, that necessitates the divine intervention Jesus spoke of, the shortening of the days.
God has to act instantaneously to prevent the total annihilation of the elect still on earth.
That's presented as the ultimate act of mercy required by the strictures of this timeline. Because the two witnesses are defeated, God must intervene and effectively shorten the days of that great tribulation. The sources quote Matthew 24. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short.
And the only viable method, according to this view, for shortening the days and saving the remaining elect at that exact moment is
immediate physical removal.
Which brings us back, definitively, to the first resurrection.
Yes. The defeat of the witnesses isn't just the end of their ministry, it's the direct trigger for the first resurrection. In that moment, all the martyr witnesses from throughout the age, and especially in the tribulation, are resurrected and transformed. And simultaneously, the remaining living saints, those who endure the 12,260 days perhaps in the place of protection, avoiding martyrdom, are instantly transformed,
Caught up together.
caught up together into the air to meet the Lord. This transition isn't quiet or secret. It's tied to the dramatic sounding of the final seventh trumpet.
And the events surrounding the death and subsequent resurrection of the two witnesses themselves are highly public, aren't they? They serve as a final, terrifying sign for the world before judgment really begins.
Oh, absolutely. It's depicted as a global spectacle. Their bodies lie dead in the street of the great city, symbolically called Sodom and Egypt, maybe Jerusalem for 3.5 days.
A short, specific period again.
Yes, perhaps reflecting the brief finality of their defeat. And the world actually celebrates. People send gifts to each other because these two prophets who had tormented them with plagues are finally silenced.
But then
Then the breath of life from God enters them. They stand up on their feet, and immense terror falls on everyone watching globally. Then a loud voice from heaven calls, "Come up here!" And they ascend up to heaven in a cloud, watched by their enemies.
wow. And this public ascension mirrors Elijah's own fiery departure, doesn't it?
It does, providing another perfect parallel. It's the final public vindication of their 12,260-day ministry, proving their divine authority even after their temporary death.
Okay, so the witnesses ascend, the saints are caught up in the first resurrection rapture. What happens on earth immediately as this is taking place? Is there an immediate consequence?
Yes, simultaneously with their ascension, a great seismic event occurs. A massive earthquake hits that same city. It destroys 1/10 of the city and kills 7,000 people.
A localized judgment.
A significant localized judgment. And the terror is so profound that the remaining survivors witnessing this incredible double event, the resurrection and ascension and the devastating earthquake, are finally forced to give glory to the God of heaven. This event effectively marks the end of the preparatory judgments and signals the imminent beginning of the final 7-plague judgment sequence.
So this whole sequence, the death, the resurrection, the ascension, the earthquake, it closes the prophetic book on the first half and formally opens the second half. The sources emphasize this sequential structure of judgment, right?
Very strongly. The ascension-resurrection sequence marks the official end of what Revelation calls the second woe. And the text says, "The second woe has passed. Behold, the third woe is soon to come." Immediately afterward, the seventh trumpet sounds.
And the seventh trumpet, its significance isn't more tribulation for saints.
No, quite the opposite according to this interpretation. The seventh trumpet doesn't initiate the saints' tribulation. It announces the massive cosmic shift of authority. The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. It signals the end of the beast's allotted time and the beginning of Christ's reign, which involves judging the defiant world.
So the sounding of the seventh trumpet is the trigger for both salvation and subsequent judgment. It rescues the saints and then unleashes the final wrath.
Exactly. The sources emphasize that sequence. The seventh trumpet triggers the first resurrection rapture event, and immediately afterward, judgment begins. This judgment is the pouring out of the 7 bowls, the 7 plagues of God's wrath. And crucially, because the saints have just been rescued and removed from the earth, they entirely avoid this final, most extreme wave of divine wrath.
It keeps coming back to that clear division.
It has to. The first half was about the saints enduring the beast's persecution. The second half is about the unbelieving world enduring the wrath of God poured out upon the beast's system and upon all those who took the mark and worshipped it. #tag outro.
Wow. What an incredibly detailed, structured, and intense timeline we've dissected today. The source material really demands that we see these final events not as just one big blur of chaos, but as 2 very distinct 3.5-year periods.
Yeah, fundamentally distinct.
Separated right down the middle by the temporary death of the 2 witnesses and the instantaneous first resurrection of the saints.
That's the crux of it. We saw that the sources absolutely mandate this clear division. The Great Tribulation suffered by the saints occurs only during the first half, those 12,260 days, under the authority of that harlot-controlled beast system.
And that period is defined not just by persecution, but also by that amazing supernatural protection provided via the 2 witnesses.
Right, and it must end precisely at the 12,060-day mark with the first resurrection. That event shortens the days and saves the remaining believers from the subsequent 7 plagues, which constitute the second half.
And the structural key, the interpretive framework running through it all, was the historical narrative of Elijah. His 3.5-year drought, the protection in Zarephath, the confrontation with the false prophets on Carmel, his temporary defeat or flight from Jezebel, and finally, his miraculous ascension.
It serves as the perfect blueprint, according to these sources, for understanding the sequence and the dynamics of the first half of the final week. It locks the ministry of the two witnesses firmly into that 12,260-day framework.
Which brings us back to where we started, in a way, the preparation required for such a time. The sources state very clearly that the 144,000 become the powerful two witnesses because they are sealed by, essentially, eating the little book, which is identified as the eternal gospel.
And that act is synonymous with receiving the Holy Spirit like the latter rain. It's this process of deep spiritual saturation with final prophetic truth and empowerment that prepares them to stand against the forced worship of the beast for 12,060 days and wield such immense world-altering power.
So we really have to leave you, our listener, with this final provocative thought stemming directly from the preparation required for these end-time witnesses. The sources claim the authority and endurance of the 144,000 was attained by fully assimilating the eternal gospel, which gave them the specific, detailed understanding needed to confront the antagonist system head-on. If the latter rain is about receiving the spirit of prophecy and deeper, unveiled truth for the final hour, what does it mean for you today to genuinely seek out and metaphorically eat the eternal gospel?
Yeah, what does it mean to be prepared, not just with an intellectual awareness of a prophetic calendar, maybe, but with the comprehensive spiritual insight and the character transformation necessary to withstand potentially immense pressure and perhaps fulfill a unique role in whatever days lie ahead?
It suggests that true readiness, according to this perspective, isn't just knowing the timeline. It's about undergoing a profound spiritual transformation, a saturation by final truth that results in the character, the fidelity, and maybe even the empowerment represented by those first fruits.
Definitely something crucial to consider as you reflect on the deep, detailed, and challenging structure of the final week that we've covered today.
Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.